William Lane Craig would like us to believe that the story of Jesus' resurrection is something that stands up to the standards of historical and source criticism. Some of the standards by which the reliability of a particular historical document are judged are whether they were written by direct eyewitnesses or whether they are written by secondary sources, tertiary sources, etc., and independent corroboration. And I'll get to those, but first let's look at the earliest gospel that describes the resurrection, Mark chapter 16. This is the passage that first describes Jesus' tomb being found empty. And let's point out a few things that make the assumption that Jesus rose from the dead look a little silly. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there's the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So the Marys go to anoint Jesus, and when they get to the tomb, they find it empty, and they find this sketchy guy in a white robe hanging out in there. And this guy tells them, you're looking for Jesus. Well, this totally isn't what it looks like. I'm not a grave robber. He's gone because he came back to life. Yeah, that's the ticket. So if anybody asks you what happened here, that's what you tell them. Now this account is not just the earliest, it's also the one that seems to be the most candid and full of common sense. Because the Marys, after seeing this sketchy-ass guy who likes to hang out in tombs, got freaked out, ran away, and didn't tell their shit to anybody. After that passage, Mark chapter 16 verses 1 through 8, there are several verses that say that Jesus appeared to such and such a place. But as a footnote in the New Revised Standard Version notes, some of the most ancient authorities bring the book to a close at the end of verse 8, which means that it's highly likely that the accounts of Jesus' appearances after his crucifixion in the Gospel of Mark were later apocryphal additions. So let's look at this first standard of historical reliability. Primary sources, sources written by direct eyewitnesses, are considered to be the ones that are most reliable. Is this a primary source of the claim that Jesus rose from the dead? No, there is no written primary source. Even if Jesus did rise from the dead, the only person who claims to have directly seen it is this sketch bag hanging out in an empty tomb. The Marys would be a secondary source, but the Marys didn't write the Gospel of Mark. So what kind of source is that? Whoever it was that wrote the Gospel of Mark was not a direct eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus, so he was not a primary source. The author of Mark was also not the one who spoke directly to the guy in the white robe, so he would not have been a secondary source. And since the earlier versions of Mark say that the Marys didn't tell anybody about what they saw, then obviously the author of Mark didn't speak to the Marys either. And since that's the case, he's also not a tertiary source. The Gospel of Mark is, at best, a quaternary source. It was written by a guy who probably heard the story from someone who heard the story from someone who heard the story from someone. The second standard of historical reliability is independent corroborating sources. Now the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John also describe the empty tomb, but the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are based largely on the Gospel of Mark, so it's hard to call them independent sources. But let's say that the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John drew from sources that were not Mark. Do these sources count as independent accounts of the resurrection of Jesus? No, they don't, because all of the accounts ultimately cite the same single source of the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. That source being the sketch bag hanging out in Jesus' tomb in the white robe. And another thing that apologists like to use to assert the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus is the fact that multiple eyewitnesses saw Jesus walking around sometime after he was crucified. But this is pretty obviously special pleading. There are a great number of phenomena for which there is very little reliable evidence that hundreds of people claim to have directly witnessed. We don't accept this as reliable evidence for Bigfoot, UFO abductions, the Chupacabra, or Elvis, so why must we accept it as reliable evidence for the resurrection of Jesus?